Pauline, I don't know, thinking about your poems, Bringing Home the Bacon, just to use that as a trope, whether the idea of slicing time out or triangulating your life has any bearing, but what I notice is the extraordinary rich inheritance with the Suett Barbieri poems and the Suett part of your family. And we have this, and we have Liverpool and your ancestry, we have some sojourn in America, and we have an influence and interest in American poetry, and we have you, and there's Holland, and there's the son of the Commission man, and you think, what on earth went on here? Because we have somebody who doesn't sound like any influence or any poem, any of those factitious or facile comments like, oh, where did you get your influence from? And you come out as a surreal and narrative-based and incredibly rich and dense poet now in Sussex, basically, an extremely fine critic of other people's work.
Well, I think that when you say where you maybe started, the thing is, when you come from Liverpool, everybody's a comic anyway. And so when I thought about writing, I thought, well, there's no point to write about comedy, or no point to try and be funny, because everybody is funny. But what did happen was, not so many years ago, my brother came across a theatre agent in Soho who remarked on the family name, which is Suett, like in the butchers with 2 T's. And one of my brothers had actually gone and chased up to the name to see where it originated, and apparently it was even established before the Doomsday Book. So we were all very pleased about that, particularly as we got bullied with being called suet puddings at school. And the outcome was that my brother John, when he spoke to the theatre agent, he'd asked him about his name, and John had just said, yes, apparently it's the only family in England with that name. And he said, well, you have a famous ancestor. And he went to his drawer and he brought out a load of billboards and etchings of a person known as Richard Dickey Suett. And it seems as though Dickey Suett was the favourite of George III and a favourite of Charles Lamb, and he was actually a star at Drury Lane for 25 years. So when I heard about this, it was like suddenly somebody gave me the key to being funny. And then quite a few people said to me, why don't you write about him? And I thought, I don't really want to write about him, I want to tell him about my life. So I sat him in the corner one day and I started to tell him about my life in Liverpool on Merseyside as a child, and that gradually developed into a kind of comic memoir of language, Liverpool language, that developed into about 100,000 words, which is still sitting in my drawer at home. But I think the actual writing seemed to start on one occasion when I was travelling through Turkey and came to the place known as Pergamon. And apparently Pergamon was the place where they invented parchment paper. So this was absolutely fascinating for me, even though I hadn't really started writing seriously. But I wrote a poem about the place, and then later I showed it to my guide, and he asked me to read it on the coach to the other members of the group. And they all clapped, and then as I was getting off, the driver stopped me and asked me to read it, which I did in English, and then he asked the guy to translate it. And then as I stepped off, he gave me a kiss, and somebody said, the muse has kissed you. So maybe that's where it did all start. But I think being a girl from a port, you always long to go to the places where the sea is and where the mixture is. And that's probably something that I try to create in my work. It's this mixture and a delight at the foreignness of life, the strangeness of life, the novelty of life, and then making it funny if I can. And I think that was probably where the idea for bacon, bringing home the bacon, came about, because what I wanted to do was, I admire Francis Bacon's work very much, but it is very stark and not easy to really face. And I think sometimes I'm used as a bridge to help people into these various worlds. And with Bacon in particular, because of the name connection, I felt I wanted to do something comic, but still bring across the basic reactions I have to his work, but then in a comic way. So that was the idea, and I wanted to have a series of poems that maybe would help people to see Bacon's work in a different light.
I mean, anyone who's known you for, well, I have about 18 years, sort of rather find it difficult to believe that you'd actually need to ask Dickie Suett, as it were, the permission, but it does seem that you've been doing it ever since. And it's narrative based. He was an extraordinary painter. I mean, there's a painting of him. It was in the National Gallery, or NPG rather, the National Portrait Gallery, that showed him remarkably, as I said, partly well attired. He died in 1801. And I thought the one thing that we get here are running gags and jokes and a take on somebody else's material, Eliot and clocks, I remember. And you have Bacon, and one has to remember that you are a wonderful surrealist painter in that kind of, what I would say, that highly finished Magritte tradition. And a lot of your work comes from that, and your husband's work comes from that too. Although I've seen much more of your work, and I have it replicated on my walls.
I think where Dickie Suett's concerned, I'm not 100% sure of this, but I think he was the first Mrs. Malaprop. And so when I was young, my father often spoke in a strange language to me, but in fact all he was doing was using malaprops, but I never knew what they were, but they just made me laugh. And so I think probably that also played a big part with what I wanted to do, was make people laugh with language.
God, well, that was Arrivals in 1775. I didn't know that. I thought it was a female role, but it might well have been, as you say, one of those, as it were, trouser stroke roles. But that's another thing about you. Your work is also very physical, it's very painterly. That's the obvious thing to say, and you're a very painterly poet. You're a person who uses intensive imagery, and that comes through, obviously. But there's the sense of the joke that is leavened with this quick-witted humour, so you never get the impastoed thick effect of somebody who writes and paints. You get somebody who is always very fluid and very quick, and is always seeing a kind of, well, the surreal dialogue, the surreal sort of, the element of the painting or the poem talking back to you, and there's a lot of this sense I find in your work.
I think that when I was painting, I painted mainly because during the day I was writing in my job at the time, and I felt that going over to the colour freed me intensely. But then when I did take early retirement at 50, I was free then to indulge in the writing. But even when I used to write, even when I painted, it was as if really I always had to get into another dimension, and I felt maybe I was a sculptor, and maybe I needed to work in 3 dimensions. And still, even as I write, I still feel I've got another corner to turn, and every time I'm chasing round that corner, but I never quite find it. But I think that gives the different angles that develop in maybe some of my poems. They are not really what I know I'm searching for, but that's what the element of surprise drives me on.
Yeah, it's extraordinary to see that, and I see that in the drama, the Einstein's Women and Einstein, and calling down the ghost of Mozart in a Liverpool bed and breakfast. But it happens. Everything about your work just gives onto another dimension, or a trap floor, or somebody in a casino, and that wonderful surreal element.
Very often it just comes from a small word or an expression, like the Einstein's Women actually came from the comment somebody made that he had big hair and he never wore socks, and that immediately put him into the world that I knew.
Yeah.
And so that's how the Einstein's Women came about. And then, because I'm also interested in science and physics, but not to any great depth, just the wonder of the universe, I felt that probably if Einstein was ever in a seance, the whole place would explode. And apparently Einstein was very interested in what is known as a cold reading. So in my play, which I hope one day will go on stage, he is desperate to get into a seance with his landlady and her 2 neighbourly friends, and they won't let him in because, the bulb explodes and the electric fire goes off, and every time he comes in, and finally he does manage to get in there. And the problem is that all his women appear instead of these ladies who do this seance every so often are hoping to reach one of their male, either husband or boyfriend or something. But because Einstein is so strong, all the women come through and they're all hiding behind the curtains waiting to come on stage to him.
They sort of claim him, don't they? But it's a play by Nick Payne, Constellations. It's all about superstring and the idea of anything can happen in infinitely second. But clever as that is, I think I have to say your Einstein's Women is where everything in the universe does happen, but it happens in a comic way, not in a predetermined manner. And I think that explains the universe to me a lot more.
I am also lucky in as much as that I have a manuscript which is probably, well, it is intended for all kinds of readership, but it might go to a teenage-based readership, and it's called the Donkey Jacket Cafe. And this one came about because I went to an exhibition of etchings by Henry Moore, and he'd said that during the work he did on the elephant's skull, he discovered that the elephant's skull had every angle known to man. And I thought, oh, that's why the elephant never forgets. This is something we've got to tell the kids about, and we need to tell the kids about it in a really funny way so that they will go into science and art before they even realise it. So the story is about an elephant who loses his memory and then comes across other animals and people who have difficult problems, but they're all solved with today's kind of new inventions.
Well, that's wonderful. I'd like to see that too. That's a prose piece, of course, and that's another of your narrative gifts. But I suppose we should certainly end with some of your other gifts. And I have no idea what poem you're going to bring out. Perhaps you don't at the moment. You're going to throw it in the air and find out.
Oh yes, I think I'll just open the page and see what I get.
Very much.
Right, I thought I would like to read one of my poems from my book called The Shirley Valentine Syndrome. But before I do that, on the cover of the book is one of my paintings, which is actually called Superstrings. And I think it helps sometimes if someone does explain some of their work to you. It helps you enjoy it more, I think. Well, for me it does anyway. And the reason it's called Superstrings is that the girl is wearing a kind of Walkman on her head. And this is in fact the formula for superstrings, which are the smallest entities which we've found that we're made of. And alongside looks like and what is a vacuum cleaner. This came about because a couple of years ago they said that they'd managed to design a vacuum cleaner that could be programmed to clean the house when you went out. And they said if we did that, it would mean that so many people would lose their jobs. So they said what we can do is give you an interim model. So they decided to give us an interim model which emits perfume. So there we have the perfume vacuum cleaner. And then we have the man who's given her a hug, and his head is full of screws because that's all he thinks about. So that's enough said about that. Now we're going to go to the poem. When I was in Manhattan, I lived in the house where Rothko had his studio. And the poem is actually for a little girl. I was her companion. She's actually Uma Thurman's sister. The house is on 69th Street, and the poem is called 147 East 69th Street. The night, exhausted, takes the subway downtown to Grand Central, changes, becomes first light. Undressed yellow knocks at the door, opens to a white buttercup. Rothko takes the flower, powders it down onto his laid-back palette, crushes sunshine into his egg-yolk day. Madison Avenue succumbs to glistening corn, pops out to watch the dollar starting to play. It was one of your better days, the day the deli man called, with foot-high hot pastrami, sizzling French mustard and perugini baci. Your purples, singed siennas and dark chocolate still slept under the stairs. East 69th Street was curdling Manhattan through your early morning colours. Pimps smelt you burning the pancakes. Police crawled along scrambled pavements. The mafia ordered lemon silk suits. The Statue of Liberty bent over Central Park, cleaned your brushes with turps. I would like to read this poem because it is, I hope, a funny one. And I love actually Stevie Smith, who actually said, "The best poetry is only a hairbreadth away from this place, which she calls sentimentality." And my poem is called At the Café Sentimental. At the Café Sentimental, they serve tea in cups with no bottoms to a vicar from Palmer's Green, and sometimes bottoms without tops, which is rather like Huntley's custards without the cream. And the drips that are seen are quite elemental, like the heavenly liquor served by a lattice-top tart, sweet on the vicar and a little oriental. The waiters wait until the end of time, washing dirty bottoms in an essence divine, and the eggs get broken trying to be regimental, and the bacon gets its back up, it's always so continental. Sometimes there's a customer, calls herself Smith, sits next to the vicar, ponders the pith. She orders rocks on the whiskey and unwinds the clocks. He's taken aback, his collar, her socks. She says, "My poetry's outside, but I'll not bring it in." He says, "No, you're right. Let it fight to stay alive in the alley on the lid near the bin." They dance at the Café Sentimental sometimes on Wednesday if the sawdust stays dry and the manager is horizontal, looking for sky in the pie, and the vicar tells the tart to get stuffed and not to be judgmental. What kind of music do they play? The kind that's left over when the piano's passed away and the waiters are sleeping under glasses stacked high, waiting for that voice from a cellar in the sky.